Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to do three things. The first thing I want to do is I want to contrast soundness and validity. We last time saw a definition of validity. We actually saw three different definitions of validity. And we also saw a definition of soundness. Now, the two concepts look kind of similar. And as we said, they're both ingredients of a good argument. A good argument has to be valid and sound. But it's worth spending a little bit of time seeing exactly how they're related to each other and exactly what senses they're different. What does soundness really add to validity? And what does it tell us about an argument to learn it's one and not the other? So that's what we're going to do in the first part. In the second part, I want to move on to talking about validity, and in particular, the relationship between validity and what I'll call the structure of sentences in an argument. So we'll see some examples that will show that in some sense, arguments have a structure, and in some sense, whether or not you're a valid argument is very closely related to what structure you have. To get a sense of what we mean, though, by structure, we need to talk about a few different notions. We need to talk about the notion of a connective and of a simple and complex sentence. Once we have those notions, we'll be able to come up with a notion of structure. We'll be able to say, what is the form of an argument, in a way that will make clear the connection between validity and form. Okay, so in this first part of the video, I want to talk about validity and soundness. What's the relationship between them? What's the difference between them? As usual, it's worth starting by thinking about the definitions. So when we have these words like validity and soundness, remember, we give them special definitions. When we're in the logic room, they only can be used in this way. So for an argument to be valid, well, one way we have of understanding that is that it's a conditional claim. So if all the premises are true, I'll write PRs for premises. If all the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. That's what it means for an argument to be valid. Now, as we said, there's a different way of thinking about it. Well, it really meant the same way, but it's a different way of putting it, which is that it's impossible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false, all at the same time. This one is often easier to think about, and it's very important for what we're going to talk about today. Because what this is saying is that validity, it rules out a certain combination of things. It doesn't tell you whether the premises are true. It doesn't tell you whether the conclusion is true. It just says the following is not true. All of the premises are true and the conclusion is false. It rules out that combination. So let's think about the definition of soundness then. So that's validity. What about soundness? We said that soundness has two different ingredients. One ingredient is validity. So to be sound, you have to be valid. But the other ingredient is that all of the premises have to be true. That's what it means for it to be sound. So if we have an argument which is valid, but the premises aren't actually true, then it's not a sound argument. So for example, we had an argument like David Boylan lives in Wisconsin. If David Boylan lives in Wisconsin, he lives in the US, therefore he lives in the US. That argument is valid, but one of the premises is false. I don't live in Wisconsin, I live in Texas. So that's soundness and that's validity. There's a few different things I want to tell you and a few different ways that I want to think about the relationship between these two things. So let's start off with this question. If an argument is sound, is it valid? If an argument is sound, is it valid? And hopefully it's obvious that the answer to this question is yes. Validity was one of the two ingredients in soundness. So to be sound, you have to have two things: a valid argument, true premises. So yes, if an argument is sound, is it valid? Let's think about the other direction. If an argument is valid, is it sound? Here, the answer is no. To be sound, the argument has to have true premises. But there are valid arguments whose premises are not true. We just saw an example a moment ago. David Boylan lives in Wisconsin. He lives in the US. David Boylan lives in Wisconsin. He lives in the US. That's a valid argument. Why is it a valid argument? Well, because it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Just try to imagine it. It's not possible. But it's not sound. Not all the premises are true. So it only goes in one direction. If you're sound, you're valid, but not vice versa. Okay. Here's another way we can contrast soundness and validity. One way, this other way, is to ask, well, what do we actually learn about the argument if we learn that it's valid or if it's sound? What do we learn about the premises? What do we learn about the conclusion, if anything? So what I want to do to try and get a grip on this is I want to point out, first of all, that with any argument, there are exactly four possibilities with what's going on. So one is that the premises are true and the conclusion is true. One is that the premises are true and the conclusion is false. One is that some of the premises are false and the conclusion is true. And the final possibility is that some premise is false and some conclusion is false. No matter what argument you have, it has to fall into one of those four possibilities. So let me draw a picture of that, a square of it on the board. So we'll say all premises false, or all premises true, conclusion true, abbreviation. Okay. That's one possibility. It could be that the premises are true and the conclusion is true. It could be that the premises are true and that the conclusion is false. Another possibility is that some premise, or at least one premise, is false, and the conclusion is true. And the last possibility is that at least one premise is false, and the conclusion is false. I'm just going to draw this as a chart. So if you think about it, any case has to fall into one of those cases. Those exhaust the cases. That's logically speaking all the possible cases that there could be. One way to think about when you learn something is that when you learn something, you are able to rule out some possibilities. Some things that were possible are no longer possible. So thinking about things like that, we could ask, well, can we rule out any of these possibilities if we learn an argument is valid? And can we learn out any possibilities if the argument is sound? So think about that yourselves for a moment. Which possibilities could we rule out in each case, if any? Okay, so now I'll tell you the answer. Let's start with validity. So let's remember the definition of validity. It's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. That's it, though. It doesn't say anything more. So if you think about it, that doesn't mean the conclusion is false or true, and it doesn't mean that the premises are true or false. It doesn't tell you anything about them individually. All it does is rule out this combination. So if you know an argument is valid, then you know that this is no longer possible. If you learn the argument is valid, you've learned it's no longer possible. But notice this leaves open a lot of options. It could be that the premises are true and the conclusion is true. It could be that one of the premises is false and the conclusion is true. Or it could be that at least one premise is false and the conclusion is also false. So in some ways, we don't learn a lot about the actual truth values of the premises and conclusion. All we learn is that a certain combination is ruled out. But if you think about it, that sort of makes sense. To figure out whether an argument is valid, that's something you can do like from your armchair. It's something you can do sitting at home. You don't actually have to do any research to figure out whether an argument is valid or not. You just have to ask yourself, is something possible or not? So it would be kind of weird if learning an argument was valid allowed you to figure out whether the premises are true, or allowed you to figure out whether the conclusion is true. Because to figure out whether something is valid, all you have to do is sort of use your imagination. You don't actually have to do any actual research. So in a way, this actually kind of makes sense, though. A lot of these possibilities are left over. So that's the situation if we learn an argument is valid. What about if we learn whether that an argument is sound? Well, if we learn an argument is sound, we can actually rule out a lot more than this. So remember, to be sound, there has to be two things. You have to have a valid argument and all true premises. So if we learn that an argument is sound, then we still know that we're not in this case, because we know it's valid. And if it's valid, this can't be true. But we're able to say more than that, because we know the premises have to be true as well. So in these two possibilities, one premise is false. That's incompatible with being sound. To be sound, all the premises have to be true. So when you think about it, validity plus true premises means that you're in this case. If you have a sound argument, then you know for sure the premises are true, and you know for sure the conclusion is true. So unlike validity, if you have a sound argument, if you know you have a sound argument, you do know the truth values of the premises and the conclusion. You know they're all true. And again, if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because to be valid is for there to be a conditional claim. If all of the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Soundness adds to that, oh, and also the premises are true. So you put those two things together, that tells you that the conclusion is also true. So that's why, in some sense, soundness is a sort of step up on validity. Because if you have a sound argument, you do know the conclusion is true. Remember, we said that's not necessarily the case for a valid argument. A valid argument just means there's a certain kind of combination is ruled out. And it's not a guarantee that the conclusion is true. On the other hand, soundness is a guarantee that the conclusion is true. So from here on out, we actually are going to be mostly focusing on validity rather than soundness. Now, you might wonder why that is the case. But if you think about what we've said, there's actually a good reason why we're not in logic class going to talk about soundness. Because to have a sound argument, you actually need to go out and do some real world or empirical research. You need to go out and ask, are the premises actually true in the real actual world? When it comes to logic, though, we're more interested in thinking about what follows from what. Because we can trust that people themselves know how to figure out whether individual things are true. They can figure out whether individual sentences are true by themselves. What the logician has to add is telling them whether some things follow from other things, whether the arguments we might be thinking about are valid arguments or not. So while we're going to be mostly thinking about validity, it's important to see that there is soundness as well. Validity is not everything, but validity is still kind of the main concern of the logician.